The autumn air hung heavy over Brookhaven, Georgia, a quiet suburban town where crime was something people read about in the papers, not something that happened on their doorstep. In this close-knit community, Daniel Whitmore was more than a neighbor. He was a hero, a wealthy philanthropist, a man of impeccable reputation, the kind who funded scholarships, built hospital wings, and handed out meals during the holidays with a warm smile. But on one cold November night, the town's peace was shattered. Julia Cross, a 34-year-old beloved elementary school teacher, was found brutally murdered in her driveway. At first glance, it looked like a random act of violence, the kind of tragedy that could strike anywhere. But as investigators dug deeper, a disturbing truth began to surface. The killer was not a stranger in the shadows. It was someone the community admired most. At first, it looked like a random act of violence. Julia, described by friends as gentle and warm, had no enemies. Nothing was stolen from her home or car, ruling out robbery. The sheer violence of the attack suggested something deeply personal, but who could possibly want Julia dead? The investigation began with Julia's last known movements. On the night of her murder, she had dinner with friends at a local restaurant. Witnesses confirmed she left around 10:30 p.m., cheerful and alone. Surveillance cameras caught her car pulling into her driveway at 10:45. Minutes later, neighbors heard shouting. A man's voice, low and angry. By 11 p.m., Julia's lifeless body was discovered by a passerby. Detectives scoured her phone records, and one detail stood out. Julia had received numerous calls from an unlisted number in the weeks leading up to her death. When traced, that number belonged to none other than Daniel Whitmore. At first, the community brushed it off as a coincidence. Daniel had funded several school programs. Perhaps he was helping Julia with a fundraiser. After all, wasn't that what he always did, give and support? But suspicions began to grow when investigators uncovered a pattern. Daniel had been in close contact with Julia more than anyone knew. Neighbors remembered seeing his car near her home late at night, and some recalled hushed arguments between the two. When detectives asked Daniel about the calls, he explained them away. Julia, he said, was helping him plan a charity event. He was smooth, calm, and cooperative, exactly as people knew him to be. But cracks soon appeared in his story. Detectives dug deeper. Daniel's alibi, that he was working late from home on the night of Julia's murder, began to unravel. Security cameras caught his luxury sedan leaving his gated property at the very time Julia was killed. Forensic investigators then discovered something chilling. A white dress shirt in Daniel's laundry hamper, with faint but undeniable traces of blood on the cuff. DNA confirmed it belonged to Julia Cross. When confronted, Daniel remained composed, even donating $50,000 to Julia's memorial fund as if to prove his innocence. His friends defended him passionately. Daniel could never do this, they insisted. He's given more to this town than anyone. But the evidence was mounting, and behind closed doors, Daniel was brought back for questioning. For hours, he maintained his innocence, repeating the same polished lines, until finally, under pressure, his carefully constructed mask began to slip. The confession that followed stunned not only the detectives, but, later, the entire community. Daniel admitted he and Julia had been having a secret affair. It had started at a fundraiser months earlier, where Julia had been struck by his charm and generosity. For a while, it was exciting, intoxicating, but soon Daniel's attention grew smothering, obsessive. Julia tried to end it, desperate to return to her quiet, simple life. But Daniel couldn't accept rejection. His public image was one of control, admiration, and success. To lose Julia was to lose face, and he couldn't allow it. On the night of her death, Daniel drove to Julia's house unannounced, waiting in her driveway until she returned. When she told him it was over, that she no longer wanted him in her life, something inside him snapped. Through tears, he described the moment. She said, "I was nothing more than a shadow in her life. I couldn't let her walk away, not after everything. I just lost control." The brutal beating had not been planned. It was the eruption of pent-up rage, obsession, and a bruised ego, a crime of passion. For the detectives listening, the mystery was solved. But for the community of Brookhaven, the real mystery was something else. How could the man they all admired, the man who built his reputation on kindness, be capable of such violence? Daniel Whitmore was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. At trial, prosecutors painted him as a man whose generosity masked a fragile ego and dangerous possessiveness. His defense argued it was a moment of temporary insanity, fueled by rejection. But the jury was unmoved. Daniel was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. When the verdict was read, Daniel showed no emotion. Some said he even looked relieved, as if confessing had finally freed him from the exhausting performance of perfection he had played for years. The fallout was devastating. Charities he once funded scrambled to distance themselves. His name was scrubbed from plaques and buildings. Friends felt betrayed, questioning how they could have been so blind. Families who benefited from his philanthropy grappled with guilt. But the deepest wound was left with Julia's loved ones, who were forced to endure the fact that the man who took her life had been a figure their entire community celebrated. Brookhaven, once proud of its shining benefactor, was left haunted by betrayal, and the legacy of Daniel Whitmore became a cautionary tale. That sometimes, the people who shine the brightest in public cast the darkest shadows in private. This has been another chilling story from Crimes and Confessions, where the truth is always darker than it seems.